There is one piece of advice that you will be given over and over when you start writing. Maybe some of you have been given it already. It's very well intentioned, but it can be completely paralyzing for a writer. Write what you know. If we're only allowed to write what we know, then we're imprisoned by what we happen to have experienced. We're imprisoned by the facts of our biology, our sexuality, our cultural heritage. Does the writer of Hamlet need to have seen his father's ghost begging him to wreak revenge on his murdering uncle and in the process murder an innocent old man? Does an actor playing Oedipus need to have killed his father and slept with his mother for us to believe in the play? Where would sci-fi be without intergalactic spaceships? Where would fantasy be without dragons? In a beautiful essay for the New York Review of Books in 2019, Zadie Smith wrote about writers having not just a right, but a duty to be free. She said, White Teeth, her debut novel, had all sorts of mistakes, I'm sure, but if I didn't take a chance, I'd only ever be able to write novels about mixed-race girls growing up in Willesden. For years now, she goes on to say in the essay, in the pages of novels, I have been both adult and child, male and female, black, brown and white, gay and straight, funny and tragic, liberal and conservative, religious and godless, not to mention alive and dead. All the voices within me have had an airing. As I saw it, she goes on to say, even my strongest feelings and convictions might easily be otherwise had I been the child of the next family down the hall, or the child of another century, another country, another God. My mind wandered. To give a concrete example, if the Pakistani girl next door happened to be painting Mendi on my hands, she liked to use me for practice. It was a work of a moment to imagine I was her sister. I'd envision living with asthma and knowing and feeling the things she knew and felt. To tell the truth, I rarely entered a friend's home without wondering what it might be like never to leave. That is, what it would be like to be Polish or Ghanaian or Irish or Bengali, to be richer or poorer, to say these prayers or hold those politics. I was an equal opportunity voyeur. Zadie Smith goes on to talk about finding great freedom in the books that she read. As a child, she says, I felt I was Jane Eyre and Celie and Mr. Biswas and David Copperfield. Our autobiographical coordinates rarely matched. I'd never had a friend die of consumption or been raped by my father or lived in Trinidad or the Deep South or the 19th century. But I'd been sad and lost, sometimes desperate, often confused. It was on the basis of such flimsy emotional clues that I found myself feeling with these imaginary strangers, feeling with them, for them, alongside them and through them, extrapolating from my own emotions, which, though strikingly minor when compared to the high dramas of fiction, still bore some relation to them, as all human feelings do. Here's another writer who has an interesting take on things. This is a Bronx-born writer, James Hannaham, and his most recent novel, Didn't Nobody Give a Ship What Happened to Carlotta, published in 2022, opens with Carlotta Mercedes, who's a black, Latina, trans woman, answering questions at a parole hearing in prison that pulls no punches. In an article for LitHub, Hannaham talks about a book group in a women's prison reading the novel. They all assumed he'd been locked up himself, did not, would not, and could not believe he'd never been incarcerated because he wrote Carlotta's experience, in their eyes, so truthfully and so faithfully. As the article reports, one lady in the prison book group smacked her lips and said, "How he know all that then? He just probably shame. Tell him it's okay to tell us. He among family with us. We won't tell." They thought it was his shame holding him back from confessing his incarceration. They could not believe that someone who had never been in prison could write the book that he wrote. So how did he write it so convincingly? This is what he says. I can't exactly explain how, without actually having been incarcerated myself, or being trans, or having had the same experiences as Carlotta, I was able to do what I did. I knew it would be really difficult, but I guess one of my superpowers is the ability to do deep research on various subjects and stories about individuals who might otherwise remain statistics, and crunch all that data into characters and human stories based on my own intuition. Creativity, he says, is a kind of sorcery, ultimately. You reach out with your mind and try to bring something in the world that you feel needs to be there. Empathy and storytelling are skills too, and like any others, they require practice and a whole lot of very deep and careful thinking. Contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, writing a novel requires a whole lot more skill than just jotting down what happened to you. I've always had an active imagination, he says, and I've been very lucky that no one in my life ever discouraged me from using it. Or if they did, I didn't listen. I'm really conscious of what an advantage that has been, and it's part of what makes me gravitate towards the material I do. I'm not at all interested in using my own life as material. After sitting with the research for a long time and writing a few drafts, I also found early readers of Carlotta who could set me straight about anything that might have been off. There's some better advice maybe. Instead of write what you know, there we go, know what you write. So how do we do that? Well, our feelings. As Zadie Smith said, she extrapolated from her own emotions. You can take that feeling of betrayal you have when a friend has backstabbed you, or the despair at a test you haven't revised for, or the sudden fear at footsteps behind you when you're walking home late at night, and augment it, amplify it, give it to someone else. The kernel of the emotion is true, and a strange thing happens when you take that emotion and give it to someone else on a blank page. It starts to become both you and not you at the same time. It starts to become something that you can give to another character, and that you can augment, and that you can change, and that you can build from. Wendy Erskine, the brilliant local writer who happens to be my own sixth form English teacher, says a very wise thing: the heart knows things. You don't need to have literally experienced something yourself to know what it might be like, or to be able to imagine what it might be like. Often, fiction can be a path not taken. The Booker Prize winner and former Irish laureate Anne Enright calls fiction often the art of the what if, the different fork in the road. If you had been born in the flat next door, if you had taken this path rather than that path, you might start with yourself and start with your own experiences, but fiction takes a magical path out of you into something quite different. Here's a fun anecdote. Steph Penny, who won the Costa Prize for her novel The Tenderness of Wolves, was discovered by the media to be agoraphobic. She was asked again and again how on earth she managed to recreate the vast wilds of Canada when she couldn't leave the house. No one ever asked her, she says, how on earth she managed to write about 1847, given she couldn't go there either. James Hanahan again. Creativity is a form of sorcery. And maybe more useful to us from a practical point of view, he does research, he writes a few drafts, he crunches the data in his own words, and then he finds early readers who maybe know more about this sort of thing and who can set him right where he has got something wrong. Because it's fine to say that we all, in theory, have the right, maybe the duty, to write outside our own experience. But the question becomes, how do you do this well? There's an artistic element to this issue, and there's also a very pressing moral one as well, because, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of the discourse in the literary world at the moment is exactly about this: who gets to tell what stories? And it's extremely important when you consider historically the voices and experiences who've been marginalized or written as caricatures or lazy tropes, or very often whitewashed out entirely. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but here are some useful guidelines that I use myself, which are inspired by and slightly adapted from a brilliant essay by the queer Korean-American writer Alexander Chee. I love this way of approaching the issue because there's nothing prescriptive, there's nothing judgmental, there's nothing punitive. It's simply a series of questions to ask yourself when you're writing about something that comes from outside of your own experience. Here's the first thing to ask. Is this my own direct lived experience? If it is, then the answer is pretty simple. Go ahead, write about it. Secondly, if this isn't my own direct lived experience, is this the experience of someone in my immediate circle? This might be a family member, this might be a good friend, this might be a partner. It might be someone so close to you that although the experience isn't your own, it's something that you're very familiar with, maybe familiar with on a daily and a quotidian basis, maybe something that you've seen over some time. If whatever you want to write about isn't your own direct lived experience, nor is it the experience of someone in your immediate family circle, nor the experience of someone maybe at a slightly greater remove in your circle, ask yourself, where am I getting this information? It may be that you have very good intentions, but you could unknowingly be replicating harmful media tropes about whatever this thing might be, this experience, this sexuality, this experience of gender. So ask yourself the next question, is there more research that I could do? Maybe there's someone you could go and talk to. Maybe there's research that you could do in a library or online. Maybe there's just a bit more thinking that you can do before you confidently write about this experience in a way that's not unknowingly replicating harmful media tropes or caricatures. A further question it might be worth asking yourself at this point is, why do I want to write from this character's point of view? Does this story contain a damaging stereotype of a marginalized group? Does the story need this stereotype to exist? If so, does the story need to exist? And why are you the one to tell it? If you think this is a story that is undertold, an experience that is not in the canon, why you? Why you and why this story? If you work through those questions, I like that at every stage, it's maybe a slightly putting the brakes on, but it's never prohibitive. It may be that you go through all of this ladder of questions and you are convinced that this is a story that you need to tell and this is experience that you need to tell in this story. So like James Hannaham, you do your research, you speak to people, you crunch the data, you use the powers of your imagination, you ask people to check whether or not this story rings true, whether the story contains damaging stereotypes, and then you produce a piece of art so convincing that people who are reading it, who are living that experience, don't believe that you haven't either. I'll give you an example of this from my own life. I wrote a story maybe more than 10 years ago now, probably a decade and a half, called Through the Wardrobe. It was in my first collection, Multitudes, which was a collection of 11 stories, all told by or from the perspective of girls and young women. The sixth story in that collection, the central story, is a story told from the point of view of a young transgender child. At the time, about a decade and a half ago, I was interested in this. I'd seen a couple of documentaries. A friend of mine had a child who wants to change their gender. And I thought, I haven't seen this very much in literature. So I did my research. I spoke to people. I watched documentaries. I went online on message boards. I feel that I was writing that story with research and with good intention. Nonetheless, I would not write that story today. The reason I wouldn't write that story today is that I think that the discourse in the last decade and a half around transgender issues and transgender rights has become so heightened and become so toxic that rather than having someone who hasn't had that experience imagining it or writing about it, space needs to be given to people who can provide experience from points of view that we might be missing. So there you go. Over the course of a writing life, over the course of a very small part of a writing life, the stories that you tell, the stories that you feel called to tell, and the stories that you feel capable of telling may well change. You're going to be readjusting all the time, recalibrating these questions of the stories that you want to tell, the stories that you need to tell. I thought I'd share with you next some of the thinking and the research that went into the making of my story, Dark Matters, for this anthology of short fiction from CERN. I liked physics at GCSE, but I haven't formally studied it since. So I ordered a bunch of books from the library and online, and I read up as widely as I could about issues in contemporary physics, and especially into dark matter, which was the subject of my story. I had some Zoom calls with Dr. Joe Haley, the scientist I was paired up with, who's based in the United States. And here's a very interesting thing. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I'd know when I found it. Gabriel Garcia Marquez puts this perfectly. He says that in journalism, one erroneous fact is enough for the whole edifice to crumble. But in fiction, one detail you need, one perfect detail is all you need to bring the whole world of a story to life. I was looking for those details. Henry James, in his great essay, The Art of Fiction, says something very similar. He says, a writer is someone on whom nothing is lost, who can convert the very pulses of the air into fiction. He's got a gorgeous image in the essay that I'll share with you now. He says, experience is never limited and it's never complete. It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web of the finest silken threads suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue. It is the very atmosphere of the mind, and when the mind is imaginative, much more when it happens to be that of a man of genius, it takes to itself the faintest hints of life. It converts the very pulses of the air into revelations. I love that. He says, the young lady living in a village has only to be a damsel on whom nothing is lost to make it quite unfair, as it seems to me, to declare to her she shall have nothing to say about the military. He gives the example in the essay of a novel that was published about a group of young French Catholic seminarians, boys training to be priests at a seminary. And there was a scandal when it came out that this novel had been written by a Protestant Englishwoman. And Henry James said that this novel had been written by a woman who was walking a staircase at dusk. She glanced into a lamplit room and saw all these young seminarians breaking bread. She was one of these people in whom nothing is lost. And from that one glimpse, from that one lamplit image, she was able to take the sensibility and create a whole novel about these young men. So Henry James says it's very important to have, if you're a novelist, the power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern, the condition of feeling life in general so completely that you're well on your way to knowing any particular corner of it. He says that this cluster of gifts, of imaginative psychic gifts, may almost be said to constitute experience. They occur in country and in town, in the most differing stages of education. If experience consists of impressions, it may be said that impressions are experience, just as they are the very air that we breathe. He finishes off by saying, therefore, if I should certainly say to a novice, write from experience and experience only, I should feel this was a rather tantalizing monition if I were not careful immediately to add, try to be one of the people on whom nothing is lost. I love that image of a spider web. There are some times when we're walking through the day, we're walking through our life, and we need to close down our spider's web powers because otherwise we couldn't function in the world. It would be impossible to walk past a homeless person in the street. It would be impossible to read about the news of everything that's happening in the Middle East and continue to function as a human being if you let it affect you to the extent that it should. So most of the time, we need to close down our powers in order to survive. But as a writer, you need to find ways of opening them up. You need to find ways of extending that vast silken spider's web of your sensibility so that nothing is lost, so that you capture everything. So I went to CERN as open-minded as I could. I didn't write my story in advance, although some writers did. There are as many ways of writing as there are writers. But But I didn't write the story in advance and retrospectively fact check it. That worked for some. But I went there with my spider's web fully extended, trying to take in everything, every sensation, every detail, to be able to make it real for my characters and my readers. I took photos and I made notes of everything, because you think you'll remember and you don't. You never remember as much as you do. So these are just a selection of the photos that I took. Flying over the Alps, arriving at CERN, the slightly monastic bed. I have the great tree outside CERN 1, where the canteen is. I collected a pine cone from it and I was photographing the pine cone to see if I could see all the layers. I was taking photographs of primroses. I was recording audio of blackbirds singing, just to capture as much as I could, just to really try to take in as much as I could of everything. Here's the great statue. I am become death, destroyer of worlds, the famous statue at CERN. But I didn't know who my character was. I took in everything. There I am in a hard hat, 90 meters underground, visiting the Large Hadron Collider. There's the antimatter factory. An amusing thing to me, at least, and to the author of Doctor Who, is that in this antimatter factory, which theoretically could destroy the world as we know it if an experiment goes wrong, everything is covered in tinfoil. Their main protective barrier seems to be swathing everything in tinfoil, which Stephen Moffat says is rule number 1 of the things you're not allowed to do if you're writing Doctor Who. So I took in everything, absorbed everything. I didn't know who my character was until I got talking to Michael Davis. I hadn't known until that point that one of the greatest particle physicists in the world came from my part of the world. And as soon as that connection was forged, it felt like a plumb line anchoring me to the story. I could suddenly imagine who my physicist might be. The physicist in my story isn't John Stewart Bell, but John Stewart Bell was born and grew up not far from the council house in which my own father was born, in which my grandparents lived. And so I superimposed him onto my grandma's council house where my father grew up. I thought about what it meant for a young boy growing up in circumstances where he couldn't afford to go to school and needed to apply for scholarship to find a way of going to university. I'd been studying at the time a lot of Carmelite theology for a project I was working on about young women becoming nuns. One of the main aspects of contemplative Carmelite theology, as per Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, is a concept of the dark night of the soul. This is the agony of the loss of faith that in their view is a very necessary, very fundamental part of the spiritual journey. And there was something about CERN, something about the simple rooms, the monastic single bed and desk that I've shown you, the quiet, the cleanliness and purity of the Swiss air, seemed kind of monastic to me. So somehow that came together with this idea of John Bell and a physicist from my part of the world. And I gave this to my main character. Something about the human endeavour, something seemed to me similar about what the women who were becoming Carmelite nuns, containing everything about their lives, going deep inside themselves in order for humanity as they saw. There was something I thought there was a parallel there. My son, when I was working on my story, was 7 at the time, and I was also trying to explain quantum physics to him in a way that would understand and excite him. And so something of that makes it into my story as well. There's a child who understands different dimensions, who understands time, who understands concepts of quantum reality by way of a series of cartoons. So all of this came together. Some of the writers in the anthology didn't mind that their science was implausible so long as the story worked. And as a writer, that's what your first duty is. But I wanted to make sure that my story worked. So a bit like James Hannaham, after I'd written my story, I gave it to the scientists to read it and check it for me. And I made changes depending on what they said about the science. And it was important to me, I wanted to check not just the science, but the atmosphere. I wanted to make sure that the atmosphere of the story felt right for them. But I think a good work of fiction should have that sense of being something that only its author could have written, and only in that moment. delineating some of those elements that went into my story, the child, the Carmelite nun, the connection with Northern Ireland. It's that particular alchemy of story and sensibility that only I could have written. So with that, I'd like to return to the advice I gave you at the start. Write what you know. Write what you know. Because there will be stories that only you can tell. Stories that are the sum of all the particular life experiences that you have lived and imagined. I would like each of you to think right now of a story that only you can tell. Maybe it's a story you know but have never read anywhere. Maybe it's a story that you always tell but have never written down. Maybe it's a story that you feel a bit scared or a bit ashamed to tell because you've never seen it anywhere else. That is a sort of treasure. If each of you went to CERN today to write a story, there would be as many different stories as there are writers. There would be ways of seeing, ways of describing that would be unique to you and only you. That's the joy of an anthology like this, encountering a wild array of different approaches to the science, to storytelling, to similar raw material. The imagination is a superpower with which we can time travel or teleport. We can know through our imagination what it's like to be someone else, even if only for the length of time it takes to read a short story. We can live through the imagination far, far more lives than we get given. There's a quote that I like by Albert Einstein: either everything is a miracle or nothing is. You get to choose on which side of the equation you live. Everything is a miracle or nothing is. But I'm going to end with a different quote by Einstein today because it seems to bring us back nicely to John Stewart Bell. The only thing you absolutely have to know is the location of the library. There's no barrier to where you can go in your actual lives or your imagined ones. Thank you.